My name is Camille. I'm 26, and up until not long ago, I was convinced I had everything figured out, until suddenly it felt like the people around me had collectively decided I was the villain. So let me explain how things actually unfolded, and you can determine whether the criticism I'm facing is truly deserved. 3 years ago, I was dating a guy named Lucas, who's 29 now. We had what most would describe as a typical and relatively steady relationship. Around that same time, I found myself diving into articles that challenged the idea of monogamy, suggesting it was more of a cultural construct, especially one that limited women. The more I read, the more I started questioning the norms. Why should I restrict myself from exploring different connections, especially if they had the potential to help me grow? One night, over wine and a conversation about our long term goals, I decided to share my thoughts with Lucas. I told him that some couples were moving away from traditional relationship models and embracing polyamory, not due to a lack of love, but out of a desire to be honest and open. I made it clear that I wasn't trying to replace him or cheapen our relationship. I just wanted the space to explore other meaningful bonds without hiding or lying, like so many people end up doing. To his credit, Lucas didn't react with immediate judgment. While his values leaned more traditional, he had always been incredibly supportive and respectful. From day one, he never tried to box me in or make me feel lesser. Over the next several weeks, we had some intense, heartfelt discussions. Eventually, he agreed to give it a chance. He said he'd be willing to work through whatever insecurities might come up if it meant honoring what was important to me. In full honesty, I already had someone else in mind when I brought up the idea. Julian was part of our extended friend group, and we'd shared a number of deep late night conversations at social events. We also worked in the same field, which added another layer of connection. And yes, there was chemistry, but I want to be clear. I hadn't crossed any lines. This wasn't about sneaking around. What I was asking for was the opportunity to explore that spark within a framework of honesty, exactly what polyamory is supposed to make possible. Lucas and I sat down and outlined our boundaries. We set a few essential rules: always use protection, don't bring emotional drama into the home, and be truthful about who we were seeing. Lucas had the same freedom to date that I did. That was never in question. In fact, I encouraged him to meet new people and find out what felt right for him. He made an effort, but things didn't exactly take off. He'd go out now and then, usually with coworkers or women from dating apps, but none of the connections ever stuck. Meanwhile, Julian and I were growing closer, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. What I had with Julian was totally different from what I shared with Lucas. With Lucas, there was comfort, routine, shared responsibilities, a calm, familiar intimacy. But Julian brought something entirely else: unpredictability, spontaneity, a rush of excitement. He'd message me out of the blue to meet for a drink or take a midnight cruise through the city. I genuinely felt like I had struck the perfect equilibrium: emotional security with Lucas and electric passion with Julian. And Lucas, to his immense credit, held the emotional weight of our relationship with dignity. He never guilted me or pried for details I wasn't ready to give. If I came home late, he'd just ask if I had fun and sometimes offer to make me tea. Everything functioned until the structure started to crack. The first major breach happened when I caught chlamydia from a casual partner. I was mortified. Telling Lucas he needed to get tested was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. He was upset, understandably, but he wasn't cruel, just disappointed that I hadn't been more cautious. After that, we both became stricter about safety, more frequent testing, clearer communication, and stricter boundaries. By the second year of living this way, we'd found a workable rhythm. Julian had become a steady part of my life, and I'd had a few shorter flings here and there. Lucas appeared to be managing well, maybe even thriving. Friends would often ask how we made it work, and I'd always point to our shared values: respect, honesty, and clearly defined limits. Lucas and I were building a life together. We shared bills, planned vacations, managed the house. He was my emotional anchor. Julian, meanwhile, represented something entirely different: a freer, wilder version of myself. He didn't blend into the domestic routine, and that was perfectly fine. We never blurred those roles. That's why, when things began to disintegrate a few months ago, I was blindsided. I genuinely thought we'd proven this lifestyle could succeed. But freedom, real freedom, can get messy, and not everyone is equipped to handle its complexities. The first signs of trouble surfaced when Julian began hinting that he wanted something more substantial. He'd comment on how we never behaved like a couple in public, how he wanted to meet my parents, or how he felt invisible among our mutual friends. I understood where he was coming from. I really did. But I also knew I couldn't give him everything he wanted without shaking the ground I'd built with Lucas. Eventually, that tension boiled over, at a party no less, and that night marked the beginning of the end. The evening was being hosted by one of Julian's friends, and the plan was simple: a chill night with familiar faces, some drinks, and maybe a few games. Julian had been counting down to it all week, excited about finally spending time somewhere we could relax and be ourselves, without the pressure of acting a certain way. When we got there, the place was already buzzing. Our usual group was around, along with a handful of strangers. The kitchen had been turned into a DIY bar setup, and in the living room, a loud game of beer pong was already underway. Julian didn't hesitate to show me off, introducing me to everyone as his girlfriend. It was both exhilarating and slightly surreal. After a couple of rounds of shots, we joined a circle of friends for more drinking games. By my third drink, Julian leaned in and asked if I wanted to go somewhere more private. He led me to a small upstairs balcony, just far enough from the chaos that we could finally talk, but still close enough to hear the music and laughter from below. That's when he started to really open up. He told me he'd been thinking deeply about our relationship, about where it was going, and what he wanted it to become. He confessed that he was starting to feel like he was constantly vying for my attention. It was a heavy conversation, but one that felt honest and necessary. We talked about our fears, what we hoped for, and what kind of future we could envision together. Then Julian said the words, "I'm falling in love with you." I wasn't entirely surprised, but still, hearing it out loud gave me goosebumps. I told him I felt the same, that what we had was growing into something much more profound than I'd anticipated. We ended up sharing a long, intense kiss right there on the balcony. By the time we went back downstairs, we were tipsy and completely wrapped up in each other. The party had grown even wilder, which worked in our favor. Nobody paid much attention to how openly affectionate we were. As the night stretched on, people began to filter out, leaving just a few scattered guests lounging on couches and bar stools. The music played on, drinks continued to flow, and Julian and I stayed locked in our little bubble. Eventually, we found ourselves on the couch together, and things quickly became physical. That's when Julian whispered that we should go upstairs to one of the bedrooms. Everything felt perfect until reality hit us. We didn't have any protection. In the heat of the moment, all thoughts of preparation had vanished. Julian said he'd try to find something, but came back empty-handed after a quick look around. I won't pretend it was a smart decision. It wasn't. But in that moment, fueled by alcohol and raw emotion, it felt like stopping to think would have shattered everything we were feeling. Julian reassured me that he'd been tested recently and was clean. I told him I had too. We'd been in a relationship for 2 years. This wasn't some one-night fling, so we made a conscious decision to go through with it anyway. And honestly, it was unforgettable. Everything we'd been building emotionally poured out in that moment of physical connection. The next morning, I woke up in Julian's bed, slightly hungover, but still glowing from the night before. Within a few days, we slept together again, still without protection. But after that night at the party, something had shifted. That line had been crossed. We were two adults, fully aware of the risks, choosing to trust each other. Then, about 3 weeks later, I noticed my period was late. At first, I blamed it on stress. My job had been pretty overwhelming lately, and my cycle had been unpredictable. But when another week passed, I couldn't shake the growing worry. I'd been on birth control for years and had mostly stuck to the routine. Sure, I'd been late taking a pill once or twice, maybe skipped a dose here and there, but nothing I thought could cause serious trouble. Still, just to be sure, I picked up one of those early detection pregnancy tests and took it early Tuesday morning before heading to work. I was convinced it would be negative and I'd laugh at myself for worrying. But then it happened. Two bold pink lines stared up at me. I froze on the cold bathroom floor, staring at that little plastic test, half expecting it to change if I waited long enough. It didn't. I called in sick and spent the rest of the day in bed, trying to make sense of what this meant for everything in my life. There were two men involved now. One was my primary partner, the person I shared my life with day to day. The other was someone I loved deeply, but who might not be ready for the kind of responsibility that could be coming. And the hardest part was knowing I had to tell them both. Telling Lucas meant admitting I'd broken our agreement, our rule about always using protection, which could jeopardize everything we'd built. Telling Julian would be a very different conversation, one about what kind of role he saw himself playing, if any, if the baby turned out to be his. I waited until Thursday evening to talk to Lucas. I chose a quiet moment after dinner when we were both relaxed. That's when I said the words, I was pregnant, and there was a chance the baby wasn't his because of what happened with Julian. His reaction wasn't at all what I expected. I'd braced myself for anger, accusations, maybe even shouting, but he just went silent. He looked at me for a long time and finally asked what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't have an answer yet. He said he'd support whatever choice I made, but he needed to know if I was planning to keep the baby before he could fully process his own feelings. Breaking the news to Julian turned out to be far more agonizing than I had braced myself for. The second I told him, he spiraled into panic. He began rambling about how unprepared he felt to become a parent, insisting this wasn't what he envisioned when we chose to take our relationship to a deeper level. Then came the hesitation. He asked if I was certain the baby was his. I admitted I couldn't say with absolute confidence, and his reaction was a confusing mix of visible relief and deepened anxiety. To get clarity, I scheduled an amniocentesis. The procedure itself was terrifying. Doctors insert a long needle into your abdomen to draw amniotic fluid for genetic and paternity testing. The wait for the results was brutal, each day dragging on intense uncertainty. When the call finally came, I was at work, seated at my desk. The test confirmed Julian was the father. I stepped out, sat in my car in the parking lot, and stared blankly at my phone, completely consumed by the magnitude of it all. I called Julian immediately to deliver the news. His reaction caught me off guard. There was no anger, no outburst. He calmly asked if we could meet and talk face to face. He said he'd spent the past couple of weeks doing some serious reflection and wanted an honest discussion. That night when we met, Julian told me he had come to a decision. He did want to be a dad. If I chose to keep the baby, he was willing to try building a real future with me. But he added a caveat. He couldn't move forward while I was still living with Lucas. He asked me to choose. Either we commit to raising the baby together, or I continue with the plan to end the pregnancy. Later that same evening, I had one of the most emotionally taxing conversations I've ever endured with Lucas. I laid everything out for him, what Julian had said, and the crossroads I now faced. I had braced for a fight, expecting him to push back, to say he'd stay no matter what. But instead, he just sat quietly, then nodded, admitting he'd seen this outcome coming. He said he had always known there was something different, more intense between Julian and me. Lucas said he noticed how animated I became whenever Julian came up in conversation, and, as painful as it was to say, he realized Julian was offering me something he never could, a fresh start and the promise of something new. What he said next left me speechless. He told me to go, not out of resentment, but because he could sense my heart was already moving in that direction. He said he loved me enough to let me pursue what might be the truest love of my life, rather than keep me in a relationship where I might forever question what I gave up. That's when I made my choice. I told Julian I was keeping the baby and wanted to try building a life together. I told Lucas I would be moving out and that our relationship had come to an end, and I began reshaping my life around the future I had chosen. For a little while, it felt like a dream. Julian and I found a charming little apartment, started discussing baby names, choosing nursery colors, and imagining our future as a family. For the first time in ages, I felt like I was living authentically, not pretending, not smoothing things over for anyone else. But then gradually, Julian began to change. He grew distant, easily irritated, and more critical of everything I did. His excitement about the baby began to dwindle. When I confronted him, he dismissed my concerns, blaming stress at work or the strain of moving. But then came the moment it all fell apart. Julian admitted he was having second thoughts. The idea of becoming a father was more overwhelming than he had expected. He also confessed that watching me break things off so decisively with Lucas had frightened him. It made him wonder if I might one day walk away from him just as quickly. I tried everything to ease his fears, assuring him this was different, that my decision to be with him was rooted in deep love and a real desire to build a future together. But Julian told me he needed space to work through his emotions. What that actually meant was that he packed his belongings and left, leaving me to navigate the pregnancy entirely on my own. At just 12 weeks, I found myself utterly alone for the first time in years. Both men I loved were gone, all because I'd followed my heart instead of clinging to the safer path. Lucas had already moved forward. He was dating a woman from his office, someone who seemed kind and uncomplicated. Julian had vanished almost entirely. What hurt even more was how others responded. Friends said I should have known better, that I'd traded stability for a man who'd never shown he was in it for the long haul. My family was baffled, unable to understand why I'd allowed things to get so messy by being romantically involved with more than one person. The months that followed were some of the most isolating of my life. I carried the pregnancy alone, no emotional support, no help from either of the men who had once claimed to love me. Eventually, Julian resurfaced. He said he wanted to be involved in the baby's life, but no longer saw a future with me romantically. Lucas, for his part, wished me well and made it clear he was closing that chapter for good. I was 34 weeks along when I found out Julian had been in a serious car accident. And despite everything that had happened, I still cared deeply. I rushed to the hospital, but what he told me when I arrived destroyed any remaining hope I had left. During all that time he claimed to be sorting out his feelings, he'd actually been in a relationship with someone else, a colleague, someone who didn't even know I existed, or that I was carrying his child. 2 weeks after Julian's confession, while I was still reeling and trying to make sense of everything, I unexpectedly went into labor ahead of schedule. My daughter was born at just 36 weeks, tiny, but to my immense relief, in good health. Julian arrived at the hospital not alone, but with his new girlfriend by his side. Watching him introduce her as his significant other while our newborn daughter lay in the NICU was one of the most agonizing experiences of my life. Things only got worse when he asked if she could enter the NICU to meet the baby. I firmly refused. His reaction? He warned me that if I tried to limit his access to our child, he wouldn't hesitate to get lawyers involved. As if that weren't already unbearable, the final piece of stability I had, my job, began to unravel as well. Just 2 weeks after I gave birth, I got a call from my employer requesting a meeting to address what they described as concerns about my performance. But beneath the corporate language, it was clear. My personal life had become too public, and they no longer wanted to be associated with the fallout. They offered me a severance deal, provided I agreed to resign. 6 months later, I had no option but to move back in with my parents. At 27, I found myself in the same childhood bedroom I thought I had long outgrown, now with a baby in tow, unemployed, alone, and without the faintest idea of how to begin again. The isolation was crushing. I had once been surrounded by friends and meaningful connections, but now nearly every waking moment was spent alone, caring for an infant. Even the friends who once swore they'd always be there slowly vanished from my life. 1 year after giving birth, I finally landed a reliable job and was able to afford a small apartment for the two of us. By then, Julian had largely drifted away. His visits were infrequent, maybe once a month, and child support came sporadically, only when he happened to remember. His relationship with the woman he had brought to the hospital had grown serious. They were talking about marriage and planning to start a family of their own. Around the same time, Lucas got married too. He and his wife had bought a home, and through mutual acquaintances, I heard they were trying to have a child and seemed genuinely happy together. Occasionally, I'd drive through their neighborhood, quietly imagining what life might have looked like had I stayed with him instead. What stung more than the silence was the quiet satisfaction others seemed to take in my downfall. People who had known me for years looked at my hardship as confirmation of their beliefs, that choosing polyamory had been naive, that I was somehow being punished for wanting more from love than convention allowed, as if monogamous relationships were immune to pain, or that following the normal path guaranteed a life free from sorrow. Despite it all, I still believe in love, love that runs deep, that is transformative and sincere. I still believe it's possible to share that love with more than one person, but I no longer hold the illusion that following your heart will always end in happiness, or that honesty alone can shield you from heartbreak. Even so, I refuse to feel shame for pursuing a life that felt honest and vivid to me. I won't accept that choosing safety and complacency would have been preferable to risking everything for something real. And I won't allow others' judgments to make me feel like I deserved the pain I went through. My daughter is now 2 years old, and she is the most extraordinary human being I've ever known. Every time I look at her, I remember that, no matter how much I suffered, she made every struggle worth it. Maybe I'll find love again, or maybe I won't. But regardless, I'll keep moving forward knowing that I chose to live boldly and truthfully, even when it demanded everything from me. Others can draw whatever conclusions they want about my path. I know who I am. I know what I've endured. And that's what counts. Because when all is said and done, I'm the one who has to live with the choices I made. And I'd rather face the consequences of living fearlessly than spend my life haunted by the regret of never having dared at all. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you like this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.